Central Montana, a January morn in the 1950s, 6:20. A ranch child stood at a bulging gate 3/4 of a mile from the house, in a cold that had not yet started to lift, watching a stretch of gravel road for a set of headlights that would not appear for another 11 minutes. There was no bus stop, see. There was no shelter. There was the gate, the fence lee, running east, until these appeared to the dark, and a child who had already learned, without anyone teach, indirectly, exactly how much to me 11 newts was, enough to feel the cold work through a coat, not enough to feel become dangerous. In ranching count, across Montana, and Wyoming's decade, a single bus was very often the only way a child reached a school. Bus and at all, once local school numbers had fallen from roughly 2,600 to a fraction of that figure across the state. And Dolly walkin' was not a real succumb, across dances measured in hours, not blocks. What had that child learned to read? 11 newts of dark and cold that no schooled rect had ever written down. And what was the bus, when it fittingly came, actually bold wrecked, hit before we contend, and have documented on, is what you've been looking for. Consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one spec, is element of American school bus culture from 1930 to the present, what the bus was, how the route worked, and what the driver and the children and knew that no school disturbed record ever captured. Not nostalgia for yellow buses, even without a ranch. In childhood, most people carry some version of those. A commute repeated so many times, it stopped being a decazon and became something the body simply knew. And you rode a school bus, and of country, or drove one, put in the comments if you rode or drove a western route where the road itself ran an hour or more each way. What is the one landmark, sound, or bump in the road you stole? Remember that told you exactly how far you were from home? A future video on this channel follows what happened to the hundreds of one-room ranch country schools these routes once fed, and where the students went when the schoolhouse closed. Back on the route, the vehicle that reached that gate was not chosen for comfort. Across rural Montana and Wyoming's per fod, the bus body most likely to be on that road was a conventional hood front desk and a steel body, produced as way by manufacturers since the late 1930s, mounted on a chassis built by Internet, Onal Harvester, or one of a small handful of other truck-based manufacturers, rather than the flat-front trans-style bod, that were becoming common cod in larger suburban ducks. The choice was not a conventional chassis, put the in front of the driver, where it could be reached, and repowered at the roads, with bass tools, some of them's warranty, or more miles from the nearest garage. It gave the front axle a simpler, more serviceable suspense on for washboard gravel and frozen ruts. Operators who worked comparable long western routes described should be durably, not speed or style, as the deck skiing factor what a D. Wetbot and Crown Coach, though built on the west coast, earns reputate on spec, ickly among doubled and run Crown 2, and deck desert grades, for frames doubled and even tripled stressed areas, and cool systems-wise, for claims summer heat that other manufacturers' buses could not sustain. What churn, 40 churns and across dozens of miles of unma. Into road, twice a day. In a vehicle twice way, actually require of the person der moot. What that vehicle equert of ever was not Mechancalsco, kel alone, rural western drivers who ran routes of length through the 1950s and 1960s, worked without any way to call ahead, and often without a paved melp. What they had stead, according to documented accounts of comparable rural school dod, was a working model of the road built, really from repetent, on, stretch of gravel turned soft after 2 days of rod, and which stayed firm, which cattle guard rattled loose. A way that meant needed report, ing before the next morn. On, it saw the road and oncome, and truck unt. Both vehicles were already close. None of the routes was routed into any route sheet a school board kept. It expected only the driver, and left at the driver when the driver left the route. A washed-out low-water cross, in that a driver had learned to read by the color and speed of the water was, to a new hur on the same route. The following September, simply water across a road, with no way yet to know whether was 4 inches deep or 2 feet. The family knowledge ran alongside the road knowledge. On a routinely spaced ranch stops, the driver was often the one adult who saw a Gavin family's morn. Every morn, for years, which stop needed an extra 2 minutes on brand, in days which families' cades were relably first at the gate and relably last, whose absence on a Gavin morn was worth meant to the school when the bus reached town. So was not sentimental, it was operational. In format on, gathered the only way could be gathered on a route, KTs by Dro K, in past the same gate, at the same hour, thousands of morn mental. In a row, what happened to that informat? The road, the water, the fam gate, when the person who held rettered, or the route was redrawn. The children absorbed a version of the same knowledge, though nobody set out to teach to them. A first of an hour or more, twice a day, across the same stretch of ranch country for years at a time, builds a geography into a child's body. Long before that child has words for. The specksy bounce where the gravel gave way to a cattle guard. The part eculering note as the bus clowned a reese, that meant 20 more mutes. The exact bend after church the school bud, or later the water tower of the console, dated town, sheriffs came to view. None of this was ponted out by an adult. It arrived the way any repeated sensat, on ours if times as no s. Then, after enough morns as informat on. This read also had's own social order, one that expatiated nowhere but on the bus and self. Long routes, in country care, idrin of every age together, from 6-year-olds to teenagers, for far longer stretches than a suburban route ever asked of anyone. Long enough that homework got started, naps got taken, and friends formed across an hour of shared, unsupervised to me, that the school day itself never proved. On a documented modern example of Trin of route, a bus run Natrona County, Wyoming, along Highway 220 through Independence Rock, toward ranch country near Meeteetse. One teenage Pater's Dolly Trep runs close to 2 hours round trip, and the driver, who has come to know the fam along that stretch personally, has been documented pause, the route briefly, so a regular raider could step newer roads. Day store for breakfast before continuing on. That common of small informal accommodated, ons not raritin into any transportate on Polsey. It exists only because the same driver has covered the same stretch of headway with the same famils, morn after morn, long enough to know exactly, inch pause costs nothing, and similes one would. What Don, old who had ridden a route, Kates for ning years know about the land, the fam old rays, and the rhythm of a ranch, in community that a chipe, directly to school every day, never sharn that hour with anyone, was simply never pass, and to learn. A route lel, kiss did not run on a songle. Eft set of condid. Ons for 10 months of the year. It ran on a calendar that shifted underneath. Spring thaw across unpaved ranch country, turned Serta stretches to a speck. Efchen of soft, deep mud that a loaded bus could not always cross, forcing detours that added mud, that school boards mudge, Eggers never fully reflected. Inter brought's own calendar, a stretch that was merely cold. November could be genuinely impassable, a February rode out, and the decon, to run or hold the bus, hen marginal cond, ins fell, hen practice less to a superintendent's off, than to the person who could actually see the road that morn. Evers on comparable long rural western routes. Desperad. Descrifting a work, in rule that had nothing to do with a thermometer or a forecast, and everything to do with what the speck, with surface underfoot was due, at that speck. With hour, the difference between snow that a bus could push through and snow that would leave, and the chafference between snow that a bus could push through and snow that would leave. That last possible, Lee, was the one that gave the dressue, Evers roll, ecular we, a breakdown or a stuck bus on a route lichthas, was not an inconvenience to be wadded out with a phone call, because for most of this perds, there was no phone to call from partway down a county road. It meant a judgment on the spot about whether to keep churchmen on a bus that had stalled, walk for help, or a judgment made with no backup and no instruct ons from anyone but the driver's own accumulated sense of exactly how cold this particular morn actually was, and exactly how far the nearest ranch house stood. What come of it stoles, to the wrench trust does it take to hand that judgment, every Sogol school day morn, to one person Dreffer's own accumulated sense. What the bus was actuating toward for most of this perdod was very often a 1- or 2-room school rather than anything resembling a modern build. Montana's rural schools peaked around 1940 at roughly 100 schools, serving about 12,000 children state D, concentrated heavily in exactly this country, and documented former students describe. Classrooms hold in every grade from 6-year-olds to young teenagers under a sixagle teacher who taught D on Mshweeve alongs in the community she served. A 1-room school photographed by a Natty and Regate, Montana, 1941, had no electricity and no running water, and students are revved on horseback, on foot, and by whatever transport it, on a family could arrange, from farms as far as 4 miles away, and's young teacher hauled her own water and heated on a stove for bath. Former students of small country schools, this can have 6 degrees already well ahead of the peers credding the tents. In dual Liz de tent, on a dozen chebble under one teacher, made possible a spec if he, educatal an advantage, that had knowing to do with the buy, allnings is a, and everything to do with scale. The bus, on a route Tetsuervino, was not simply delivering Aldrin to an instant on. It was the dolly connective tool, issue of an entire small commune, to had grown up together from age self. A school whose serval was many of these towns, understood as inseparable from the serval of the town self. What was actually at stake for these commune at ease when the number of children on a route dropped low enough that keeping the local school open no longer pens it out? By the 1950s, 1-room schools across Montana and Wyoming were already understood, within school administration, as a system on its way out. Better roads improved rural transport econ, along with declosing rural populat ons as ranch, ing operate one's console, dated onto fewer larger hold, ings made it administrat. Vidly log, cal to close small local schools and bus the were students to newly built console. Dated schools graded classrooms, gymnasiums and spec. Lee's teachers. Montana's roughly 100 rural schools of 1940 fell, over the following decades, to a small fraction of that number, with only a few dozen survive. Into the 21st century, each closure meant the same trade for the fam. A route that had run a handful of minnels to a fam, or 1-room build, ing became a route run considerably farther to a school, the community del bu, staff, or fully recognize as his own. What consolate on del, Verd was real, broader cur, comment, speculous teachers, faculous no single ranch, comment, teacher blow, could other ranch in comment, could other was afford. What took, less rably, was the specus, local knowledge chapter has been document, in the derver who had learned a road over years, now dervzing a longer unfam, or stretch, or being replaced out might, by a new head cover, ing a route built from scratch, the be-mate, one teacher classroom scale, that former students cred a leching genu advantage, and the shorter lech that had let children start the school day already near home. None of that loss appeared in our school board's cost analyze. What the driver who took over a newly extended consolidated route have to learn for his own first winter on, that no one had thought to warn about. Some of these routes never got shorter. They got stud, mapped, and eventually tracked. But the raw distance that a very low populate on dens, P puts between a ranch gate and a schoolhouse has not gone away. In present-day Wyoming, Natrona County School D, #1 alone care, is 6,280 students a day and logs over a miles a year on buses, not even count 2 of longest. One documented a teenager from ranch country near Meeteetse, spends close to 2 hours a day, roughly 120 meters round trip, on a single bus, one through the pre-dawn dark, past a only known hark landmark before the sun comes up over the highway. Her driver has held that route long enough to know her family personally, to let her step off for a few newts at a roads to store, and to trade small news with her mother at the stop. the same informal accumulated knowledge that drivers on routes wevers have always built, run now with a GPS unmounted on the dash instead of a paper trep sheet. That GPS on track and the parent-facing tracks include in Wyoming's Laramie County School, T. have introduced the past several years, represent a genuine change. Parents can now see roughly when a rural bus will reach a stop, and a DHVDU can be alerted the moment a bus was swapped out for mech and cow trouble. But the technology runs to the same geography and is meant to manage. A tracking app depends on ACT, self-serve, and the exact stretches these routes were built to cross, the long gaps between ranch gates, the low populatios that made a single bus route necessary in the first place, are often the same stretches where a cell signal drops out and pearly. What exactly has changed for a family at the end of a Wyoming ranch road, and what, despite everything, has not? A teenager who spends 2 hours a day on a bus has, without particularly mean to, built the same kind of embedded knowledge that a child on a Montana route. 1953, built stretch of way means she's halfway there. Which turn means the dref. Let her hop out for breakfast. Which stop belongs to which family. Documented report ing on day. Bess an old knee. Injury from ranch work that she stretches out on the long ranch. At childhood spent move, in between a ranch immediacy and other family arrangements, and an ambit meaty became the same and eventually returned to ranch. An ordinary, speck of the Mary, coronary, and extraordinary, dully distance that has simply become the shape of her morn, and even mare. The weight became the shape of ranch come move. None of the news because Meade was unusual for her. It made the news because to anyone else that world, 2 hours each way sounds lick. Chuke an emergency rather than an ordinary. That gap between what looks remarkable from outside and what feels route from ins is the same gap is in document. Your chapter has been document in whether the vehicle was a 1950s convent, Wyoming body bus on a Montana gravel road, or a modern bus or with a GPS untit on a Wyoming adway. What does real mean that the dolly realty of these fam sees unchanged in its bossy shape across 70 years, despite every improvement, road, RAD-O and route software, cell depends that's a heavily on the spec, sig judgment and accumulated knowledge of one door, ever, alone, on one very long road? If this channel is going to keep document what was in these routes, and the people who drove and rode them, subscribe. There are more buses, more routes, more drivers and more cheese, and Aldrin's geographs that were buses by Dolly repeated on and never written down. Even Rud out a ranch. In pulled hood, most people carry some verse on of this. A commute repeated so many times, it stopped being a decazon and became something in the body, imply new, and you have a memory of a bus, a druv, a route, a bump, in the road that told you where you were. Put in the comments if you rode or drove a western route where the rod itself ran an hour or more each way. What's the one landmark, sound, or bump in the road you stout? Ill remember that told you exactly how far you were from home. A future VTO on channel follows what happened to the hundreds of one-room ranch country schools these routes once fed, and where the students went when the schoolhouse closed. Montana's rural schools fell from roughly 1940 to a small handful by the century's end, and most of the short local routes that served them appeared along with them, replaced by longer dated runs whose drivers had to buffled route knowledge from Noth, one washed-out cross, and one unreliable cattle guard at a timey. What the new routes gave the children who rode them. Broader cur, culum, spec, is teachers, a gymnas, what they did not gov them. The local school, a driver, a teacher, and a set of fam. Ease had all buddled together, and the shorter fam that had let a chobber start the school day already close to home. And yet the exact ranch counts is where this changed the most. The underlying arithmet of distance and low populat on never went away. Neem were graded onto newer buses, GPS-un and cell-dependent track, naps that catch'll fall across the same gaps in coverage that made a single bus route necessary, the surest place. A teenager rails a day through Wyoming In ranch country today knows the spec. See bend, the spec. If landmark, the spec. If pause outs, D the spec. If store, the way Chi Oldrin on a Montana route. 1953 knew the bump at the county lem, and the Engine's note on the H. That knowledge was never thing. And route sheet then, and's not fully captured by a GPS app now. It exists only in the people who rid and drive these roads. And dreads appears, the same way it always has, the moment a driver redders or a route's redrawn, with no one having thought, any other century, to red it down